I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Lisa McEntee-Atalianis, a professor of applied linguistics at Birkbeck, University of London. Lisa's research focuses on language policy, identity, and multilingual practices within international organizations, particularly the United Nations. As a founding member of the NGO Committee on Language and Languages and a member of the Study Group on Language and the United Nations, her work is at the forefront of supporting effective multilingualism globally. Today, she will present exploring dangerous, hegemonic, and celebratory multilingualism, language policy, and the United Nations, where she will examine the challenges the UN faces in putting its multilingualism policy into practice and the language ideologies that can undermine its goals. So before I hand over to Lisa, I'll just ask that Dennis Kelechi Okpara can be ready for after. But now the floor is yours, Lisa.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me today to talk about my research on language in the UN. Although I'm not going to be explicitly addressing the UNESCO theme, I hope that the discussion of language policy and ideology in particular, you'll be able to see that translate across in terms of my research on language in the UN. Now, as many of you may know, the UN professes a commitment to supporting multilingualism. Let me just start from here. Sorry. Um, and a recent report by the UN in 2023 actually reports that multilingualism strengthens dialogue between people from all backgrounds and ensures tolerance among countries. And without multilingualism, the UN wouldn't be able to function effectively. But the reality behind this rhetoric is that issues of equity, efficiency in communication, and the very real pragmatic difficulties of the cost of supporting multilingualism through language services, through interpretation and translation within the organization, and the use of different media are very difficult. So for the UN, like many international organizations, language issues apply to a very complex web of agencies, departments, bodies, entities, and activities. And the main challenges for the organization have been the need really to offset tendencies towards economic pragmatism and expediency in terms of turning the work around very quickly, with the protection of democratic rights and linguistic diversity, both within the organization and outside of it as well, aligning linguistic support and organizational goals with an expanding network of internal and external stakeholders, and working within the constraints of its inherited ideologies, policies, and practices. So for language planners and academics like me, several questions arise in relation to this, including what are the pros and cons of the different practices? How do language managers balance issues of equity and language parity, efficiency and cost within these organizations? And actually, are there alternative language regimes to those which have established themselves that might be considered? And if so, how might these be examined via policy analyses? Now, languages are therefore both a resource and a problem for regional and international organizations. And in designing and implementing effective language management policies, language planners really must consider the linguistic needs and skills of their employees and stakeholders, and the resources available to support the chosen language regimes. So, for example, at headquarters in New York, as many of you may know, at high-level meetings such as diplomatic plenaries, they often operate in numerous languages supported by professional language service personnel. Whereas at lower level meetings, so working groups, correspondence groups, as such as they're called, often where the main work is achieved and diplomacy is achieved, these function in far fewer languages and often just with one, without any language service support. The administration of the organization also only operates in a limited number of working languages too, often, well, in New York, French and English, while correspondence and work with NGOs, stakeholders, or citizens outside of the organization and in the field for things like humanitarian missions may demand linguistic skills which aren't provided for by the languages supported within the internal functioning of the organization. Now, the UN's language policy has really evolved slightly over the years. At the outset, those involved in its formation recognized that it must even symbolically strive for inclusion. And so it tried to accommodate the languages of the victors of the Second World War, whilst also recognizing the fact that a high number of Spanish speakers were amongst its founding states. So, Article 111 of the treaty specifies that the Chinese, French, Russian, English, and Spanish texts are equally authentic. And the intention at the time was that these five languages would become recognized and established, although in practice, French and English became the working languages of the Secretariat, and simultaneous interpretation in all of the five languages was considered at the time quite problematic. But the language regime changed and grew in subsequent years. Currently, there are 6 official languages with the addition of Arabic in the 1970s. And these are supported officially at headquarters in New York, particularly servicing the work of the main entities, the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the Social and Economic Council, with the addition of working languages. So the Economic and Social Council has 3. It has French, English, and Spanish. The General Assembly and Security Council has 2, English and French. And of course, the Secretariat still functions in English and French. Since 1995, a resolution on multilingualism was passed by all member states, and this has been discussed biennially ever since within the General Assembly, leading also to the Secretary General making a report on multilingualism every 2 years as well. So the issue of multilingualism is certainly central to the organisation. But the de facto reality, as shown in my research, is that multilingualism is still only supported at high levels of functioning, with English dominating pretty much in lower level meetings, as well as in written texts and in communications external to the organisation. At headquarters in New York in recent years, attempts have been made to review and reform current practice and to mainstream multilingualism within the organisation, and also in external duty stations and in field and in outreach work. Various activities and resolutions have ensued, but repeated inspections by independent inspectors within the UN have identified, and I quote, the piecemeal and fragmented approach to multilingualism across the organisation, and really the pervasive hegemony of English and inequity between the organisation's languages, arguing therefore for a need for reform. Now, the current Secretary General has championed multilingualism as a core value of the UN. He's argued that it guarantees the effectiveness of our multilateral system. And he has, to his credit, initiated the most extensive and intensified work programme to date in order to mainstream multilingualism and to raise awareness about it in internal and external operations in compliance with General Assembly resolutions. Various actions have been listed as shown on this slide, but there's much work still to be done. And as finances are stretched and as workload has increased, the organisation's been seeking what they call euphemistically as cost-neutral solutions to the problem of supporting multilingualism. In other words, looking for solutions beyond those of paying for translation and interpretation services. Overall, the de jure multilingual policy stands in stark contrast to the de facto reality. Despite vain attempts to balance provision and promote multilingualism within and outside of the organisation via such things as today, language days at the UN, the parameters of efficiency and cost within the current operating regimes have prevailed, and this has led to the dominance of a few elite languages to supplement and relieve the work of their language services, and has particularly bolstered the use of English, such that internal and external communication sometimes can only be guaranteed in that language. So the established language policies reflect ideological perspectives which contrast with nationalist monoglot ideologies and policies which frequently frame multilingualism as dangerous or as disunifying within national borders. In contrast, the UN champions multilingualism as a mechanism and a symbol of unity, working to achieve aims such as international cooperation, peace and security, and human rights. And this celebratory multilingualism is often problematic, not least because of its simplistic and reductive assumptions about sociolinguistic realities. Indeed, within the UN, as in other intergovernmental organizations, new discourses about multilingualism aren't necessarily progressive, nor are inequalities resolved. Rather, as Pujolo contends, national elites have developed new ideological arguments to maintain their legitimacy and dominant positions. And ultimately, this means that the same powerful languages may remain dominant and elite, leading to hegemonic multilingualism. This version of multilingualism assumes that only selected languages will and should have status in supranational organizations, leading to the disenfranchisement of some speakers. And one example of such disadvantage emerges in contexts of employment within the Secretariat of the UN, when roles are dependent on multilingual proficiency in elite languages, especially in English and French. And this ultimately restricts employment access for citizens of countries where elite languages aren't national languages, nor indeed are indigenous languages. So the push to the selection of a few elite languages over the 20th century can be explained, of course, by national investment and the development of international alliances and networks. And this prompted nations, as Pujolo has stated, to negotiate their interests and strive for a share of power in the global arena. This has also led to the development of third-party alliances, leading in some instances to the formation of language power blocks. That's to say, groups of nations with common linguistic and cultural agendas, who previously shared constituencies or colonial subjects. One key example here, of course, is La Francophonie, which arguably perpetuates France's political influence over its former colonies, and especially Africa. And this occurs via the reframing and repositioning of French, not as a national language, but rather as a language of an international alliance, a language used to articulate human rights rhetoric, advocating for peace, democracy, and cultural diversity. And indeed, we witness these language power blocks at the UN, not only La Francophonie, but also the Friends of Spanish. We also have Arabic-speaking groupings too. So Rachel Vesey and I have argued in a recent paper that dangerous, celebratory, and hegemonic or elite multilingualism actually provide really valuable multilingual ways of seeing language ideologies as a useful lens in the analysis and interpretation of language policy and behaviour in organisations like the UN. Given the ongoing difficulties in implementing and sustaining multilingual language policies, then, I argue it's prudent to explore different approaches to reform, drawing on those debated by policy theorists of different disciplinary stripes. Overall, there's agreement that the status quo is largely unsatisfactory and reform is necessary. And two major alternatives have been debated in the academic literature. The first is a reductionist perspective, developing language regimes which support lingua franca, in particular English, versus a reformative perspective, involving a more stringent policy analysis to determine the benefits and costs of more flexible regimes of communication, which could support a range of monolingual and multilingual options, taking into account the demands of the context or the domain of interaction and the weighting of values and principles, for instance, avoiding disenfranchisement, prioritizing efficiency, and taking into account economic considerations. So to take the first suggestion, given current inequity in language provision, one solution is to change the language regime by reducing the number of official or working languages to just a few, to perhaps English only. Arguments in support of this have included, as shown here on this slide, amongst others, reducing the cost of language services and the alleviation of problems associated with the quality, quantity, and efficiency of interpretation and translation, reducing current rates of disenfranchisement experienced by those whose languages aren't supported as official or working languages, because everyone then would be expected to learn and use one working languages, with the exception of those speaking the L1. A reduction in rivalry or disagreements about uneven support given to the established official or working languages, And so the list goes on as shown here. But arguments against include, especially arguments against the monolingual regime or English only, state that it's really unfair. It undermines equality of rights to expect member states and their citizens to comply with international law if they can't access laws in a language they understand. Native speakers of English, of course, benefit disproportionately, and they benefit materially since they don't have to learn or expend resources in using a second language, whilst also benefiting from those who do via gains in provision of language services, language teaching, proofreading, editing services, and so on. And they're further advantaged rhetorically since competence in English affords them an upper hand in debates and through the course of democratic decision making. And again, the list is extensive. So in contrast to the reductive approach, others, including myself, have argued for a reformative approach, which offers more flexibility in current operating conditions by carrying out analyses which allow for a comparison of the effectiveness and fairness of different language regimes, ideally suited to satisfying variation in goals, as well as constituencies and communicative capacity in any setting or meeting. And this takes into account two very important parameters, what are referred to as allocative and distributive effects. So allocative effects include analysing regimes looking at the comparative efficiency and cost effectiveness of particular language regimes, and also distributive effects being, who will be the beneficiaries, who will be the losers in particular circumstances. And through this type of analysis, simulated scenarios based on real life settings can be used to assess levels of disenfranchisement in different work domains or in the field. And in turn, these can be operationalized to nurture and support a dynamic ecology of different scenarios based on requirements. And these scenarios can accommodate changing priorities, needs, and the fluid configuration of language skills of delegates or administrative officers or stakeholders in different settings, for example, in administrative meetings, in working groups, in plenary, in the field, rather than just relying on the fixed or indeed no provision that currently exists at high or low levels of functioning in the work of the organisation. Now, in modelling these different scenarios, considerations of the number and type of official and working languages, and the number and direction of translation and interpretation, and the language skills of individuals, both active and passive, and the learning needs of personnel, amongst other considerations, can be taken into account. Now, this recommendation demands extensive research in order to assess and creatively remodel resources to accommodate multiple scenarios of interlingualism. But certainly models exist already, and the research has already been underway. So to conclude, the present intergovernmental system is supported by a network of unequal interstate relationships, and it's said to have led, as many argue, to political crises of efficiency, equity, and legitimacy. And as discussed, this inequity is really exacerbated by and can be seen, of course, no less sharply in matters of language provision and use within international and regional organisations. This not only affects diplomats, but it's also a matter for non-state actors who are either positioned to effect change in state functions or are recipients of UN operations or aid, or they need access to information from international organisations in languages they understand. Expansion of membership and shifts in the outward-facing roles and work of international organisations have meant that an equally radical shift in language policy and planning theory and research is needed. And as such, the time is ripe to re-evaluate language policies, to review current operations, and consider alternative models of communication. I end on a cautionary note, however. In light of shifts in the world order in recent months, and indeed as we've all seen in recent weeks, quoting from one of my recent publications with Rochelle Vesey, supranational organisations like the UN are facing mounting pressures and decreasing support from membership with an increasing nationalistic world order. The re-emergence of nationalism, coupled with the astronomical rise of technology, raises questions about the future of language policy and language services for international organizations. It therefore behoves us as linguists to ensure that languages and the vital role of professional language services are placed centrally in global political endeavours, and that language issues are prioritised within organisational language planning. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Lisa, for that fascinating exploration of multilingualism at the United Nations and kind of the ideologies that shape it as well. We have time for one quick question. Um, and just in relation to the reductionist approaches that you mentioned, if they were to be put into place, I know you touched on how it might impact citizens. How do you think it could affect the United Nations itself?
I think it would be absolutely devastating. I mean, it is in effect, as I say, in the lower level meetings where a
Yeah.
lot of where the diplomatic work is achieved. But it would lead to huge levels of disenfranchisement. There's an assumption that all diplomats speak English. In fact, they do not.
Mhm.
And so, it would be. I don't think actually even it would be perceived. It isn't perceived within the UN that such a thing would be possible, even though
Okay.
some people suggest, it would save a lot of money to move down that
Mm.
route. Um,
Yeah.
but they appreciate that yeah, a ridiculous assumption.
Yeah.
So
Thank you so much, Lisa.
my pleasure. Thank you very much.